David Ignatius, foreign columnist and associate editor of The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor, has been watching along with us. Look, obviously very heavily focused on foreign affairs, the $300 million the United States is going to give to fight gangs in Haiti, although we're going to see Kenyan troops there, no American troops. He reiterated again, talking about the growing debt, the problems, the crushing debt, really, for developing nations like Kenya. A lot of that money owed to China. But I thought the toughest question, maybe, David, for President Biden was about the ICC warrant on Benjamin Netanyahu, the International Criminal Court, charging, as the reporter said, Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war against Hamas and against the Palestinian people. And I wonder what you make of President Biden's response and whether you think this showdown is really heating up in this fight between the court and Israel, with Joe Biden and the United States in the middle.
So I agree with you. That was certainly, from an American standpoint, the most newsworthy thing the president said. He was emphatic. He didn't use a lot of words to say it. He said the ICC has no jurisdiction here. He said there is no moral equivalence between Israel's actions and those of Hamas. Just totally rejected the request that's been made for the ICC to issue a warrant. The warrant's not been issued yet. I think this issue obviously is heating up. There's a way to go before there actually would be escalation with seeking a warrant, making it difficult for Israeli leaders to travel. But the president was blunt, direct, short of speech in his response. This really was an event that was focused on Kenya, and the idea the United States is pressing for much more meaningful partnerships in Africa with Kenya. I thought that part of the news conference couldn't have been clearer.
One of the things that they did, so help us understand, because I think a lot of people will watch and they'll try to figure out why. There aren't state dinners, for example, and state visits that often. This is a 3-day visit. I was with President Obama when he went to Kenya back in 2015. The major issue was security then. A major issue is security and the economy now. So in, I guess, those broad categories, that hasn't changed. But one of the things that the United States has done is to designate Kenya as a major non-NATO ally. Why is this important, and why is this 3-day state visit even taking place? Why Kenya?
So I think the answer to that is that the Biden administration wants to make Kenya a showpiece, if you will, of a broader effort to engage what we call the global South, the countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia that China is aggressively courting with loans, with assistance of various kinds, economic development projects. And President Biden was elevating the status of Kenya, that phrase, a major non-NATO ally. That's kind of right up there with our key partners who are not actually part of NATO. And then also, interestingly, trying to draw Kenya, and by extension other countries in Africa, into the expanding world of technology opportunities. There's a lot of reference to green technology projects in Kenya. I found it very interesting that the president is going to ask for funding for Kenya to be part of the CHIPS and Infrastructure Act, the big effort to build American technology. He wants to extend that to Kenya as a partner. So I think it's an attempt to say to countries around the world, we're in this game too. Don't think that China is the only country that's seeking to interact with you about economic development and security issues. We're there too.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as well, the funding from the CHIPS Act. That's the first African country that would get money from it. And also, right, that student exchange involving STEM students. I also want to bring in NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander, who is in the room. I think I heard your voice, Peter, asking some of the questions. The president didn't take the bait, but we were talking about the question about the ICC for President Biden. But what's your big takeaway from this press conference?
Well, I think you and David hit some of the key takeaways there. I, too, was struck by the president announcing that he would be supplying Kenya with some of the investment money provided by the CHIPS Act, which was focused, as you noted, on trying to provide more technological, more microchips being produced here in the United States, so the U.S. didn't have to rely on the supply chain. He was very blunt in the way he addressed the situation with Israel, saying that there should be no equivalence between what Hamas did and what Israel did. There were a series of other topics that were on the top of my tongue that I was hoping to ask the president about, specifically as it relates to some of the news of day, as we describe it, politics. His reaction to Nikki Haley making it official yesterday, saying that she will be voting for Donald Trump in the election this fall, despite her repeatedly attacking Trump throughout the primaries, the last Republican candidate standing. Donald Trump has said very little, if anything, about it since then, but Joe Biden had that opportunity now. How will he try to win over those college-educated, those independent voters looking ahead to the general election this fall? There are other questions as they relate to the debate, why the president thought it was necessary to hold the first debate in June, and why he has decided that there is no reason that he should hold any more than 2 debates with Donald Trump. There have been other offers. He has agreed to do only 2. And then finally, as it relates to the issue of the Supreme Court right now, with a series of decisions on its plate, most notably as they relate to Donald Trump, presidential immunity, one of the issues before the court, other issues as they relate to Donald Trump's effort to try to overturn the 2020 election, questions about the election integrity in general, whether the president would have any comments specifically about Justice Samuel Alito and the new reporting, first from the New York Times, about multiple flags now at a Northern Virginia home and at a home in New Jersey where the justice was flying flags that had been embraced by rioters on January 6th. The president not keen to take that question either. But the bottom line, the focus of this visit, really to sort of further embrace Kenya right now, to make a clear message to the people of sub-Saharan Africa, to the people of Africa broadly, that the U.S. does want to be engaged in that effort, that the U.S. has investments, and that democracy can deliver. It comes amid so many of the coups we've seen there, the instability throughout that region, American troops being kicked out by the military junta in Niger most recently. So really a lot of challenges there. And it should be noted that this tonight will be the first this is the first state visit, with the state dinner to take place tonight for an African nation dating back to 2008, the 6th state visit that President of the United States, Joe Biden, has hosted since taking office. Chris.
Peter Alexander and David Ignatius, thank you guys both. I really appreciate it.